And in both cases, this is all a challenge for both you and me, because so much about bread baking is about how something smells and how the dough feels and how the bread looks. And we're trying to do this virtually. So we're going to try to come up with as many analogies as we can to communicate what is it that we're looking for. First of all, I would like to ask you, use your chat box or that way of showing hands. How many of you have made sourdough bread in the past? Good. All right. So lots of us are bread makers, whether they're new ones or we've got 10 or 20 years experience. We've all had our hands in the dough. Now, I also saw some responses that said, no, I've never made sourdough bread. And maybe some of you have never made bread at all, and that's great. We will start from wherever you are. Those of you who have made bread, I'm sure that you can make comments or you can ask questions that'll help all of us as we're trying to make our way through this session. I'd also like to know, since we're doing introductions, what state are you in, or what city and state are you zooming in from? I'd really love to know what the kind of geographic distribution of participants is. Wow, we've got a couple of Torontos. Oh, Australia. I am thrilled with everyone who's decided to kind of join us today. This is so much fun, I'll tell you. In a time when we're told that we can't physically be together, it's so great to have this meeting of the minds and a gathering of passions around bread. I've been a bread baker since the early 70s. I do not come from a bread baking household. It was not something that my family did. There was a lot of phenomenal cooking going on, but baking, not so much, not at all. And so I actually became a bread baker by going through the many books that were available starting in the 70s and building on from there. And in fact, I actually became a test baker for someone who was putting out a book, among many, let me just mention. So sourdough, all right. I'd like to ask you now too, what is the biggest challenge or disappointment that you've had when you've been making or using sourdough starter? And Mike, I'd really like you to take a look at this as people decide to give their comments so that we can make sure to address some of these issues. All right, so sometimes one way of approaching a project like sourdough, both the starter and the bread, is to take a look at what is it that we want to get in the end? I mean, what's the result we're after? And so I've got two examples of the results we're trying to get. And I'll start with the bread itself. And I'm going to show you just a couple of loaves that I've made over the last couple of days. So I'm just going to step out and bring them into the screen. And Mike, you have to tell me if I've got these in the right spot. Mild French sourdough loaves baked just yesterday. And you can see they have really good oven spring. There was a lot of separation at the slashes. This is using a basic recipe. Now I'm going to show you a variation made with the exact same basic recipe. Here's one that I made in a conventional bread pan. And this one is filled with polenta, with toasted sesame seeds, with toasted sunflower seeds, freshly chopped rosemary, and oil. It's a denser loaf, as you might imagine, with all of that in it. But it uses the same basic recipe and moves on from there. So the kind of starter and the kind of dough that we'll actually be developing in part 2 gives you a lot of opportunity for variations. Polenta and sunflower seeds is one, but you can do semolina, you can do fennel and fig, you can do Kalamata olive. So the starter that we're making today is going to allow you to move into all kinds of directions. All right, so that's what you're looking for in the way of the bread. What is it that you're trying to achieve? What's the standard you're trying to get to when it comes to developing a starter that will get you that kind of bread? I'm going to show you the starter now, the end product. And this thing is just, it's so active, it popped the cover off of the jar. So what you've got here are loads and loads of bubbles at the surface. This thing is just chugging along. Now,
Sylvia, if you could back a little bit.
Hold it higher and back.
Yes.
All right. There are the bubbles. You can see them. Some of them are going to burst right where we're watching. That is a vigorous sourdough starter. How does it smell? You know, it's fairly sweet. It doesn't have a really strong smell. This is a young starter. Mild French sourdough does not have super tang unless you develop it into a tangier starter. But this is what you would use to start your loaf of bread. And how do you know if it's ready? Well, I'm going to give you one demonstration. One part of it is these bubbles. Another aspect is the smell. Now, is it whiting it out too much though, so that they're not getting detail? I'm talking to my husband. He's trying to shed some light on this. The other aspect is, will it float? So a test of the readiness of your sourdough starter is really, really, really important. Because you can have a sourdough starter that you've been working on for a long time, but if it's not at its prime condition for actually leavening your bread, it's not going to work. So I've got a bowl of water in front of me, and I will lift it up in a second, but I'm going to pour some of this starter onto it. And what you see here is that this sourdough starter is floating at the top of the water. That is a sourdough starter that's going to give you really good rise when you start to make your dough. All right. So that's what we're looking for.
Sylvia,
Yes.
Is the water room temperature? Is the water room temperature?
Yes, the water is room temperature. And most of the things that you want to do is working with materials that are at room temperature. Yeast, whether it's a sourdough yeast that you made yourself, a natural yeast, or a yeast that you've purchased, commercial yeast, if you subject it to high temperatures, it will die. So you do not want to get above 100 degrees. I wouldn't want to get above 90. You always have to use things that will be nurturing to the yeast, and that means you got to stay away from really high temperatures. Cold will do another thing. Cold will slow the activity of the yeast a lot, so much so that you might think this thing is dead. If you leave it in a really cold situation long enough, and I don't mean frozen, but cold, it will die. So you're looking for room temperature. Now, most cookbooks, one of the things that you may want to take into account is that most cookbooks assume that your kitchen is at 70 degrees. So if you're working in a kitchen that's really cold and you don't understand why your food is not cooking or baking or mixing well enough, it may be because of the cold kitchen. I'll take this one step further, just outside of bread baking for the moment. If you're making food, if you're baking, if you're creating a batter of any kind or mixing something that has eggs in it and those eggs are cold, or any of the other ingredients are cold, they will not mix well. and you will not get the end product that you want. You need to have things, unless otherwise specified, at room temperature. Okay, so this is your starter and it's floating. How did we get here? Well, getting to this stage is a multi-step process. So let's start. I'm just putting that away. How do you start this?
Could I interject a question?
Yes. You bet.
We live in a hot place like Australia, average temperature 35 to 40 degrees Celsius in the summer. So what if you live in a place, as long as your starter's around these inside, does that work?
There are two things. And could you translate that Celsius to Fahrenheit so that I have a better understanding of what we're talking about? Forgive me for not knowing how to do that conversion really fast.
Would be over 100 degrees.
Okay. Couple of things. It's a challenge. I totally agree with you. It's a challenge. And certainly I've chatted with bakers that are in the tropics, some that are in Thailand, that do really well with their sourdough bread. But it's a matter of trying to keep things as cool as possible without them becoming cold. And also understanding that the process is going to go faster for you because you're in a warmer place. And in fact, when I give my classes, I give bread baking classes that are usually 4 and 5 hours long in my teaching kitchen. One of the things we know is that you can use temperature to either hasten a process or slow it down. Add degrees, things go faster, make things cold, and you can cut down rise times, let's say, when you're actually building your bread. You can influence those tremendously for every 17 degrees Fahrenheit of temperature that you deviate from 70 or 72 degrees. And we can go into that, into the greater detail when I do my actual bread class, because that is one of the things that you really do have to take into account. And you can use temperature to put something in the fridge and walk away for 12 hours. Come back and resume the process. I mean, you can use it to bend your bread baking to your schedule. But if you're in a hot climate, I would suspect, unless you want to work very, very quickly, you're going to want to do things to kind of mitigate that heat a bit. What I'm going to do now is kind of take a look at making sourdough starter. And I would suspect, especially because there were so many people who responded, yes, I've made sourdough before, that you have used many, many, many different ways of making the starter. There are as many ways of making a starter as there are Facebook groups, websites, books, and magazines. Some use grape skins in an effort to introduce yeast spores into their starters. Others use pineapple juice. I've seen some use sugar. Others use boiled milk that's been cooled down. There's many, many approaches. I'm going to focus on one, and that's the one I tend to use. However, as there are questions, let's bring them up so that we can actually take a look at things. The starter method that I use really focuses or has two strategies. One is to try not to make so much starter that you end up tossing out a lot of waste starter every time you refresh it. That is one of the biggest complaints I had as I started making sourdough bread was, wow, every time I have to refresh my starter, I'm tossing out just huge quantities of dough. That's not necessary. That's not necessary. The second strategy that I use, so it's keeping the quantity small. The second strategy I use is actually using a two-step refresher. Again, in an effort to keep your quantities down and to give you even more flexibility in the kitchen. So let's start with quantities, all right? Well, I'll step backwards even. Let's start with flour. Some people ask, well, Sylvia, should I use all-purpose flour? What about bread flour? Should I use whole wheat flour? Should I mix it in with some rye? You can use any of those. Any of those, I would not go for a straight rye because I think it's a bigger challenge. But there are people who do it and do it very successfully. I tend to start my starter with a 60% composition of bread flour and a 40% composition portion of either rye or whole wheat. Now, why the bread flour?
Sylvia?
Yes.
Man, you have a couple questions. Can you use bleached flour for the starter? And while I'm at it, if we use grapes, what should I look out for? Can it contaminate it?
Two good questions. All right, let me go further here. Can you use bleached flour? Yes, you can. I don't know that it's going to be vigorous as you'd like, to be honest. I think we need to use whatever we have on hand. First of all, let's all feel real comfortable about that. What are the things that I tend to try to go for if I can? I tend to try to go for flours that are not bleached, that are not bromated, that have been grown in ways that are friendly to the land, friendly to water. And so, you know, I go for those kinds of flours. They tend to be more expensive. And so the whole idea of minimizing how much starter you're throwing out is really important. And right now, when so many of us don't have a lot of flour on hand, it's good to be as conservative as we can be. And we can come back to that because bread flour, all-purpose flour, pastry flour, and cake flour are all different from one another. They all have different protein levels, with bread flour having the most protein and cake flour having minimal protein. Why? Bread flour, the protein that it's got is called gluten. And gluten is actually a combination of gluten and gliadin. Gluten and gliadin. Those two proteins, when you mix up water and flour, recombine the protein chains in order to make the strands that make bread, that hold in the carbon dioxide that's emitted by the yeast, and that traps that carbon dioxide so that the bread will rise. In bread flour, we have a lot of gluten because you want the bread to rise. And when you're making a hearth bread, when you're making something like a mild French sourdough, you want a nice crust, you want holes inside in the middle, and so you want a stronger flour. You can use all-purpose. That's what you've got, use it. If you are working with a flour that has no gluten, I really don't know what to tell you because I don't know how to work with a flour that has no gluten in it. It will not perform like a flour with gluten in it. Coconut flour does not perform like wheat flour. Flax flour, quinoa flour, oat flour, they do not perform the same way. So you're going to be looking at making a very different kind of product. It may be just the product you need. So, you know, I'm willing to work with you to see how do we make this as best we can. And I've done numbers of work with non-gluten flours. But for this class, for right now, we're looking at wheat flours. So you've got your flour. You've got water. I do not use anything else when I make a starter. I do not add any fruits. I don't add any yeast. I don't add any sugar. It's all just flour and water. And that alone can grab the yeast from the air because these yeasts exist all around us. They're on your hands, they're on your kitchen counter, they're in the flour. And if you use a rye flour in your mix of flours to use for this, you're actually bringing in a lot of natural yeast into it. And that's why it's often used in the mix of flours, because it does tend to bring in those yeasts that you want. Let's say you don't have any rye flour. You can still do this. You can still do this. So let's look at what we're looking for. So here's my little bowl, glass bowl. And again, Mike, I need some direction from you to make sure I've got it in the right spot. It's just an empty glass bowl.
Looks good.
Okay, and all I'm going to do is add 1/4 cup of flour. That's it. Hold on a second. I was going into my cabinet to get my 1/4 measure. All right, so this is a little jar of flour. And I have made it a mix of 40% rye and whole wheat kind of mixture and 60% white bread flour. And I'm adding it to the bowl. There, big deal, just put it in. Then I'm going to add enough water, and it's about 3 tablespoons of water, so that I make a bit of a thick batter. Okay, so here's my water. One, two, three. You can actually eyeball this. My little spoon. Now I'm just mixing it up. I could have added more water to this, so I will. All right.
You go back just a little bit. There you go.
All right. Mix, mix, mix. So right now I'm trying to work some of the lumps out of it. All right. And in fact, what I'm going to do is add just a little bit more of the flour. Because again, as I said, this part is not real critical. What you're looking for more than anything else is a certain texture. All right, this is better. Okay, so what have we got here? I'm gonna lift the spoon so you can see kind of how thick we've got it. You see that there? And if it were a little thicker, that would be fine too. But you want to mix it really well, because the oxygen that you kind of put into it as you're mixing is important. Now about water. If you live in a place that has highly chlorinated or fluorinated water, you want to see what you can do to set that water aside so that it degasses and you don't pull that into the mix. Okay, we're good. So what am I going to do with this? Well, here's where I mentioned bring a jar. Any jar. This is a 8-ounce canning jar. a used 8-ounce canning jar. You can have another kind of jar, whatever kind of jar you have on hand that's empty. And I'm just going to put it in there. Eight-ounce canning jar. There's loads of room in it. We're not making starter that fills up a quart jar. We're not going to be using up as much flour as you'd need in something like this. This is what I'm after. So now what do I do with this? What I'm doing is for the next 3 days, next 2 days, I'm going to let this sit. But before I let it sit, I'm going to cover it with a piece of paper towel. And let's see, I thought I had a rubber band here. Maybe I don't. Yes, I do. A rubber band. You're on your way to making a culture. That's all it takes. One of the things you might want to do is pull out what I consider to be one of the most essential pieces of equipment in my kitchen, masking tape. Because what I do with masking tape is that I create a tiny little label and I put the date on it, so that I don't forget when I started this thing and how often I need to take a look at it. And I just put that fancy label on the side of my jar, and that's it. So I let this sit for 2 to 3 days. What am I looking for? What does a culture look like? How will I know if anything is happening here? Well, understand that it may take 2 or 3 days, or 3 or 4, or 5 or 6 to get to a point where you think that your culture is active. So what does that look like? Let me show you. For this class, I actually did numbers of cultures, starting them in over successive days. So I've got 5, 6 different jars at my side. This is number 1. And I actually made this, when was this? I made this on the 18th. So it's several days old, and I've already used this to make the next step, which is the mother. So right now it just looks kind of loose. Hold on. This is past its prime. There's no bubbles in it. It did have bubbles before when I caught it at its culture. So I'll show you that. Let's see. I've got several samples here that I'm checking. Okay. Interestingly enough, even though all of these cultures were started in my kitchen and in different days, some of them are more active than others, even though they're younger. So this is a fairly active one, and I'll show you what that looks like. When your culture is active, when you know it's ready to take your next step, which is to take it from a culture to a mother, what happens is that it forms a crust across the top, a dark crust, and it stinks. It actually smells like dirty socks. It does. And when you pull back the crust, you start to see bubbles. So let's see. Kind of hard to do when something is so small. This one's not good. There we go. So I'm going to pour this out And I'm hoping that the first thing that comes out is that crust. Yep, it was. There we go. I'll lift it up. It's actually a hard crust that forms at the top. And what you've got are bubbles underneath. Here's another one. And again, these are challenging things to try to imagine through Zoom. Here's another crust. It's really dark. It really sticks together. It kind of forms on the top of your jar. And then underneath it are bubbles. And that's when you know you can then move to your next step. One of the things you don't want to do is rush. Sourdough really requires that you practice patience and make your decisions based on what you observed. So if your starter has a crust on it, pretty heavy, dark crust, and if when you pull it back, you notice, oh my gosh, there's some bubbles underneath, that's when you want to move to the next step, which is to make your mother. So what is a mother, and why bother going through this step? A mother is when you take that culture and you start what some bakers call is training it. You're training it to increase in volume and deflate, increase in volume and deflate, increase in volume and deflate. So earlier today, I took one of these jars of culture that was ready, and I made the beginning of a mother. And the mother, let's see, has already risen some, which is really good. So mother is a training tool. You have it get big and then deflate. How do you make it get big and deflate? What you do is you take your culture. Here's a new jar. Here's my active culture. I'm going to put 1 tablespoon of it in a jar. And to this, I'm going to add a 1/4 cup of flour and about a 1/4 cup of water. And I do suggest that you start with the water first, mix it into that new culture, and then add the flour. Otherwise, it's really hard to mix. So I'm just taking a 1/4 cup of water, mixing it up. When you mix it up and use a spoon, I suggest that you use either wood or plastic. Sometimes metal can really introduce strange flavors. That's a 1/4 cup, is it? Yeah, a little bit more. Again, this is not the really precise form part of baking. You'll get to a very precise form of baking once you start making the dough. Okay, so you had some culture in here, you've got water, and now you add the flour. And you mix. It's a little bit thick. I'm going to add a little bit more water. Again, you're looking for a certain batter consistency. Oops. There we go. This is good. And again, the mixing is so much easier if you add the water first. So what am I looking for in the way of consistency? Now, what do I do with this? Again, your mother is your training, is your starter on training wheels, pretty much. So what you're gonna do, and I guess I had asked that you have on hand a piece of paper toweling, put it over, use a rubber band or a string. You're gonna put the date on this. $4.23. And what you're gonna do now is watch it. I've put this tag kind of at the level of where this mother is sitting. And what I want to observe is that it rises. Now it'll rise for a few hours and then it's gonna fall flat. So what you're gonna wanna do is actually check it, like 6 hours, 8 hours, 10 hours, because you're gonna refresh it on a 24 clock basis. But you're gonna wanna see, did it go up at all? And then did it come down? Because then you know you've got something that you're training. And it will go up and down. It may not go up and down a lot at first, and eventually it will. One of the things I guess that I warn about is that if you put just a really tiny bit of culture at the bottom and a whole lot of flour and water, it's going to overwhelm the culture and you're not going to get the activity you want. So try to make sure that you've got at least a tablespoon of that culture in there, and you're only adding about a quarter cup of flour and roughly the same amount of water. Mix it really well till you'll have that batter consistency. And then now start watching it as it goes up and down, up and down. And you want to do that for like 3-4 days. So it's not like forever. It might feel like forever, but it's not going to be forever. And once you've got that culture performing up and down, up and down, up and down, you can take your final step, which is actually make a starter. And the starter is going to take a couple of days. So here's your culture. Here's your mother. It's been working for a while. Now I'm going to actually make the starter with a strong culture. In each case, going from step to step, you're looking for something with strength, with good yeast in it, so it will take you to the next step. So you've got your mother, which has been going up and down for 2-3 days. You take a tablespoon or 2 of that, you put it into a jar and add maybe a ½ cup of flour and a ½ cup of water. Mix it really well and leave it for 10 to 12 hours overnight. The next morning, you should have a really significant rise in that new starter. If it's not significant, don't worry about it. This is a process that has some give to it. Wait a little bit more and see what happens. Let's see, this is actually a new starter. This one has been rising, let's see, it's risen a good ½ inch since in the last 9 hours. This is a brand new starter. It's going to take it a little while to get its strength, to get its muscle. So I'll wait that requisite 24 hours and I will refresh it. And then it should perform a whole lot better. You don't want to rush it. You want to make sure that it's risen as much as it can. Then you pull out a couple of tablespoonfuls of that starter. You add that half cup of water, half cup of flour, and let it rise again. Eventually, you get to a starter with this kind of strength, where it's just filled with bubbles. You can't hardly contain it. It just keeps on going, going, and going. Okay, questions?
Okay. So one of them is, what do you mean by refreshing it?
Okay. Refreshing it is adding water and flour to a small portion of an old starter so that you get something that's really vigorous, because with lots of bubbles and lots of yeast activity. Because a starter, the yeast in a starter is consuming all the sugars that are in the flour and water mixture and making them become gas, carbon dioxide, and alcohol. That's a byproduct. If you do not periodically take a bit of that starter, like 2 tablespoons, put it into another jar, add the flour and water, the yeast will eventually totally exhaust your starter. That's why, excuse me, that's why refreshing is necessary. You don't want to ever start making some bread with a starter that is depleted. You will not get a good bread. One, it will taste bad. And 2, it will not get the oven rise that you should be getting out of your bread. So part of the challenge in making sourdough is catching your starter at its peak. But you can do that by planning ahead. You know, I want to make bread, let's say, in the afternoon, you know, or I want to make bread in the evening when I come home from work. Well, I've got to have a refreshed starter for that. So I need to give myself 8 hours, 10 hours for that starter to refresh itself. That means you refresh your starter before you leave for work. I tend to make bread starting in the morning. So I refresh my starter to make sure I have a really vigorous starter with lots of active yeast. I tend to refresh my starter in the evening. I mix it and put it at the counter, and by the next morning, it is bubbling over. That's what refresh means. It means to feed it so that it has enough flour and water to keep the yeast active and multiplying. Because that's one of the things that you get in sourdough bread that you don't get when you use a commercial yeast and make what they call a straight direct bread. You do not get any of the yeast action. You do not get yeast duplication. You do get yeast action in the form of releasing carbon dioxide and alcohol, but you don't get yeast that actually replicate themselves. That's why the flavor of straight dough bread is so different from that of sourdough bread. And what makes the tang in a sourdough bread? It's not the yeast. It is bacteria, which grows in combination with the yeast. It's what makes sourdough bread sour.
Great.
Any other
Sylvia,
questions?
how often do you refresh it? People are wondering about that.
Okay, so that gets to the maintenance issue. Is there a question other than the refreshing that I should address? Because I'll focus on that then next.
Sure. Do you add flour and water to the mother during those 3 days when it's going up and down?
Yes, very good question. Thank you for catching that gap in what I was talking about. Yes, every 24 hours, you get rid of some of that. You get rid of 80% almost of the mother. Add water, add flour, mix, and set aside. Yes, thank you for that question.
And there is a question about how long until the mother forms. Maybe you've answered that, but.
Okay, so we start out with a culture, remember? those 2 to 3 days, 3 or 4 days, depending on what's in your kitchen, where you have to wait until you get a crust forming and a smell emanating and bubbles forming beneath that kind of crusty surface. Then you make your mother. The mother is about 2 tablespoons of that initial culture. You add your flour, your 1/4 cup of flour and your 1/4 cup of water to that mix, roughly, so that you get that thick batter. And you wait 24 hours, see how it rises and falls. The next day, you do the same thing again to see if it's a stronger mix. And you do that for 3 or 4 days because what you're doing is training, they call it training the mother. And then from there, you go to the actual starter. So after you've done that mother training for 3 or 4 days, then you actually make your starter. You take a couple of tablespoons of that mother, put it into a jar, add 1/2 cup of water, 1/2 cup of flour, mix it really well, put it away, cover it. You're always covering these with either a paper towel or with a cloth napkin. You can use either one. And you're seeing that starter should start to work really well. The first time it rises, it may not be super. It's still kind of gaining its strength. And so the first day, after 24 hours, after you've made your brand new baby starter, you may actually discard a lot of it, which that's to me feels bad because that's really wasteful. Then you do it a second time. You leave yourself a couple of tablespoons, good tablespoons, at the bottom of that jar. You add your flour, you add your water, cover it, put it away for about 12 hours, and you should have a growing starter. And let me just mention that starters can get stronger and stronger over time. So you can also mess up along the way. And you will recover. You can recover your starter and get it strong again. And that's a question about how often do you refresh? Well, that is a critical question because it's what really makes people shy away from sourdough bread and making and maintaining a starter, because they think, I'm going to be chained to my kitchen looking after this starter. Lots of people have named their starters and have propagated them for just years and years and years. I've lost starters and I've started them up again. I've got some that have lasted for months and months and years. So don't be too worried if you lose it, because you can redo it. And also don't be too worried if it looks dead. And I'll get to that in a minute. But talking about refreshing, you should refresh your starter. Well, you should, books say, refresh your starter at least once a week. Well, I don't know if you bake every week. If you don't, what I really advocate and what I have tended to use, I'll be real honest, is a 2-step refresher. All right, so you've made some bread, okay? And you've got a little bit of starter left in your jar. Now, if the starter jar that you're using doesn't look too darn crummy, you can use it again. I know I tend to use them until they look prehistoric almost. What you can do is take that jar with your couple of tablespoons of that active starter that you had used to bake bread, and you add just a 1/4 cup of water and a 1/4 cup of flour to it. It's a small amount. It's not covering very much of your jar bottom. I leave it out for 3 to 4 hours. Again, covered. This is at room temperature. And in those 3 and 4 hours, you're getting really active replication of yeast in your starter. But it's not going full bore. You're not getting bubbles coming out of the top. And certainly you're not having a huge amount, probably not enough to even bake with. But what I've got when I do that is I've got a starter that I can store in the fridge, knowing full well that when I want to use it again, I'm going to have to take 2 steps to refresh it into a starter stage that I can use for baking. So when I make this starter, and I'll call it the starter that you store, again, the jar had some starter in it. In fact, I'll demonstrate it with this. Empty jar. Super active sourdough starter. Let's see if I can get a glob that's just a tablespoon. This stuff is so rich and thick. Yeah, this is enough. There, it's almost too much. So there's like 2.5 tablespoons of starter in there. What I'm going to do is add about 1/4 cup, maybe a little less. Let's make it 3 tablespoons of water. That does it. And now I'm going to mix this. Hold on, I'm going to grab another spoon. Okay, here I am. I'm going to mix this because I really want to get that water to break down that thick starter that was sitting at the bottom. All right. So this is really soupy. Really soupy. Now I'm going to take some flour. And I'm going to start here with 1/4 cup. This is very imprecise. I'm going to add it. Mix it. Whew. All right, this is good. I'm going to add a tiny bit more flour so you can see more of what I'm looking for. All right. This is what I ended up with. This is thick. This is really, really thick. This is much thicker than the batters we've talked to this point. This is my storage starter. It's heavy in flour, proportionally very heavy in flour. And what that allows me to do is to let it sit for 3 to 4 hours, begin to have yeast activity going on. But there's so much yeast, so much flour in there that it actually serves as food for the yeast. It's almost like a little seed culture. It serves that yeast for a longer period of time, so that after 4 hours, what I do is I stick this in the fridge and I can keep it there for a couple of weeks. Now, what do I do if I want to make bread? Well, I take it out of the fridge and I know that I've got to refresh this twice before I can use it. Now that adds time to my schedule. That means I got to plan a bit more diligently, but also prevents me from wasting a lot of flour. So what I do then is I take a look at this culture, and it will have risen a little bit, but not much. I throw out a good half of it, add flour and water, let's say 1/3 cup of each, put it aside overnight. The next day, there will be good volume, but it won't be as strong a starter as I need. So what I do is toss out most of that, then add my full 1/2 cup or cup of flour, cup of water, mix it up really well. And that is what I set aside at night to be the starter that I'm going to use the next day.
Can you use a stainless steel bowl? Can you use einkorn, which has less gluten in it? Can you use spelt flour? Another question about the grapes. So if there's a brief answer to some of those questions, maybe
Sure.
you could address those.
Yes, you can use the grapes. They'll bring, the thing to look for if you're using grapes, is that they're organic, because you don't want any kind of herbicide or pesticide brought into your culture. The reason why people use grapes is because the bloom, that kind of whitish powdery thing on the outside of the grape, is rich in yeasts. And so that brings those yeasts into your starter and actually gives it a good boost. Can you use einkorn and spelt, kemmer? You certainly can. I have not worked too much with those, although I've got right now a 50-pound bag of einkorn that I will be working with. Because they have actually different chromosomal compositions than other wheat, and because of their varying gluten levels, you'll find that your starter is going to be working differently, but that doesn't mean it's not going to work. So yeah, by all means do that. Can you use a metal bowl? Yeah, you can use a stainless steel bowl. You can use a metal bowl, but I would not store anything in metal. You can use it to mix, but I'd use glass. Well, let me just mention that this was a form of bread making that was the dominant form of bread making before there was commercial yeast. And that only came on the scene in 1938. So I can fully appreciate that this sounds confusing. It's a multi-step process. Certainly people use different ways of approaching it, and by all means, there are so many good resources out there that might be helpful to you. Don't give up. This is a process that will be forgiving. Just try it again. I've lost starters, I've regained starters, so you can do it. And certainly I hope that the handout will help a great deal. And we can do this together.
And definitely, you know, as some of you probably know and have probably signed up for, we have the second stage to this on May 5th. So Tuesday, May 5 at 6 o'clock, we'll be having a follow-up to this, right, Sylvia, where you're going to actually
Yes.
mix and bake some bread and go through those steps.
Well, thanks an awful lot.
Thank you, and thank you, Sylvia, especially. It's nice to see you all. We really appreciate your involvement with us. Send a video out shortly so you can look at it along with Sylvia's PDF. All right, good night, everybody.
Thanks, Mike. Good night.